In 1987, workers pried up the pulpit stones of the abandoned Pine Hollow Church and drew out a wrapped book that smelled of damp oak and lye. Inside lay the private journal of Pastor William Phillips, with 3 tight entries dated 1834 and one page torn, where a sentence ends in the air. For 3 days, he chronicled the arrival of the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twins Clara and Celeste, and what the congregation said could not have happened under any sky. The entries repeat a single hour again and again as if time failed to move. 2:17 afternoon. 2:17 afternoon. Words mirror themselves in the margins in a hand reversed left to right. Heartbeats written as little marks pair, and then drift and then snap back together, as though one chest were breathing for 2. The last line before the rip reads, "They divided the light between them. I could not tell which child stood in which place any longer." Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to walk 3 days that Pine Hollow tried to bury, and a county chose not to map and comment which place you watching this. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? They went under the floor where the pulpit had stood and found more than dust. In the spring of 1987, the county crew came with pry bars and a promise to clear the old frame for timber. The church at Pine Hollow had been left to weather and bats and a ribbon of ivy that had grown bold enough to thread the bell rope. No road signs pointed there. The maps the men carried showed a blank pinch of ridges and a dashed line that faded before the creek. They set their hands to the stones that had held the pulpit steady through half a century of sermons and turned one aside. Under it lay a packet bound in twine and stained the color of damp oak. Lie. Smoke. A hint of lamp soot that climbs into everything and never leaves. They carried the bundle into the gray daylight and unwound the cord. A leather cover showed its fish spine through cracks. The first leaf lifted slow as a breath that did not yet trust the room. Foxing the color of old tea bloomed on the page. A hand had passed there when ink was not yet dry and left a shine where fingers once pressed. A pressed blade of grass slept in the gutter between leaves. A hair crossed a line and divided a sentence like a small bridge in fog. On the first page a name, Pastor William Phillips. A place, Pine Hollow Meeting. A year, 1834. Then 3 entries that bear dates like wounds, and a 4th that ends, where the paper gave way to a hand that could not stop in time. The handwriting is not the sort that tries to dress a story. The pastor counted weather first in small letters that never leaned. Then fever. Then a name, if a person had done a kindness or a stubbornness that might teach someone else 3 winters later. He had no taste for the crank and the grand word. Men like that enter their books in flourishes. This hand came down in clean lines, as if a straight fence had been set in a day and never wavered again. On those 3 leaves the fence falters. He puts it in the first line of the first day. The Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived at the noon hour with 2 small girls upon a mule, and the bell rang once for me and twice for the ridge, and I did not pull a second time. The hour in the margin says 2:17 afternoon. He underlines it once. Then again, he will write that hour each time he stops to swallow. He notes that the twins were 9, that their dresses were the same cloth, and yet sat upon them different, as if a seamstress had measured a body that stood in 2 places at once. One girl favored her left. Hair parted left. One girl favored her right. Hair parted right. He writes their names in a careful balance that looks like a prayer, that wishes not to offend any listening ear. Clara. Celeste. He adds that the father rode a mule that kept no rhythm. Then he stops and writes the hour. 2:17 afternoon. He underlines it and places a small dot to the right, as if to fix the time in wood. From there the words begin to turn on themselves. He begins a line that reads their voices came together, and apart like and pauses, as though the simile had fled out the door. He writes again 2:17 afternoon. Then the next line he sets down in a different hand, mirror script, left to right reversed as if the book itself had bent backward to look at its own face. The letters are his and not his. The phrase says, "Let them be one." And then there is a space where the ink thins and sinks, and the words appear again forward in small letters that refuse to lift from the paper. You can feel him trying to walk a straight path through a place that is not straight. It is not only words that turn. The margins carry little pairs of strokes like tallies made side by side. 2, 2, 2. They appear at the end of lines where a name stands. They appear at the end of prayers. They appear where a girl has spoken something he did not intend to record, and yet could not live with himself if he left it out. He writes that when the bell was pulled once, the rafters answered twice without a second hand upon the rope. Then a line that does not belong in any church book. The dead of the ridge were recited, and then recited again backward without a stumble. He says he does not know which child spoke the names, and which child did the backward work, because they were not two voices. He marks 2:17 afternoon. The book smells of ash when you turn the leaf. On the second day he abandons the calm he has made for himself all his years. He borrows a tuning fork from the schoolmaster. He writes the bowl of water, and the sound of the fork, and the small hill the water made, when one girl spoke, and the small valley it made when the other girl spoke, and the way the bowl stopped being water for a breath when they spoke together. He writes the hour. He underlines it again. 2:17 afternoon. A dot to fix it as if he fears the time will slide. He calls a physician from 3 ridges west, who puts hands to small wrists and reports 2 pulses that begin and then drift and then begin. He cannot bring himself to use a word like marvel. He writes only that the doctor said sympathetic fever with no heat, and then names the soil in his yard, because he understands soil and grain, and has nothing else that is firm enough to hold in his head, while the girls sit on his bench and take his kitchen into their looking. You can see where the ink runs thin, as if he leaned too hard on the pen and pulled more than liquid from the bottle. You hear the room where he set the book. A parsonage filled with the small fatigue of a life that did not ask for spectacle. A kettle that circles counter to the stirrer's hand. A looking glass near the door that fogs when the girls pass and then clears before their father. A barometer from a peddler with a crack across the glass, and a pin that tooches when the bell speaks without rope. When the twins recite the Lord's Prayer, one voice lags less than the time it takes for a second heartbeat to answer a first. He writes this as a fraction, and then draws a small cross through the mark, because the math of it makes his hand shake. Mountains of Colorado territory. He keeps putting the hour in the margin not because he wishes to tie the day to a clock, but because the day has tied itself, and he is making a note the way a man makes a knot in a rope, and knows he will have to return to it in failing light. On the third day, he goes to the creek with them. He cannot say more than that without the paper beginning to fight him. Each line breaks at a word that would have made sleep impossible forever if he had set it down. He says, "The water came up and not down," and then scratches it out and writes it again, because to scratch it once makes it worse. He says the bell answered from the church without hand and without boy in the loft, and he writes the minute under the time that is no longer a minute. He writes 2:17 afternoon. He underlines it until the page threatens to tear under the weight of insistence. He writes one reflection where there should have been 2, and then he stops and places his palm there. You can see the blur his palm made. The grease in a man's skin keeps a small archive in it. The words we can read after his hand lifts go thin, and then fall into the line that has brought you here. They divided the light between them, and I could not tell which child stood in which place any longer. The sentence does not end. The paper does. There is no closing prayer, no amen, no small piece of weather to restore the world to something men can bear. The next leaf is torn a finger width from the gutter, and you can see where the twine that held the packet together pressed a memory into the edge. Workers stood over that page and turned a little to keep their shadows from falling on it, and felt a draft where there was no door and no window that would open without taking a hand off a bar. One man laughed. He said a book can trick an afternoon into thinking it knows a story. Then he set the journal down, and he did not touch it again. Another man swore he heard a bell, and no one answered him, because anyone who has swung a hammer all morning will not admit that a sound can be made by something nobody sees. Pine Hollow did not wish for this book to see the light. The place never liked a map. The ridge carried its own names in mouths that never learned to lay right on the printed page. The congregation kept minutes when the temper held, and tore pages when it did not. In a year, when cholera came on a horse, with no rider, the records say nothing for 3 months, but weather and a line about the cost of lime. Those who lived through it did not need to see the fear made neat on the page. Those who came later would have turned away. And yet here is a man who did not turn away. Pastor Phillips sat at a kitchen table where the lamp had been trimmed and the wick kept honest, and he kept his eyes where they should have been and his pen where it could do no harm. And then for 3 days, a thing stepped into his house and asked him to learn to look twice. The journal did not want to live under a stone. It fought the lie in the floor with its own slow salt. The twine that held it remembers the shape of the weight above. The damp entered enough to make the leather sour, and never entered enough to lift the ink from the rag paper. Someone had laid it there with care. Someone had said to a boy, watch. Someone had set a stone down and pressed it until the corners gritted. Why? Because a thing like this draws people like weather draws flies. Because a county knew it would empty a room faster than cholera. Because 3 days had made enough of a crease in a pastor's life to leave the parsonage out of plumb, and the parlor door not quite square, and the meeting house minutes so cautious afterward that a deacon could have drowned his own confession in them, and no one would have found it again. Because this is the sort of year when 2 children can divide the light, and a man with a plain hand can be asked to set the word for what he saw and fail. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to step into a room where the hour refuses to move. We will read the 3 entries that made a grown man stop his own pen. We will stand in the doorway of a church that rings its bell for a ridge and a ridge only. We will lift the book and smell oak and lie and smoke, and know we are holding more than paper. The cold open is always a kind of mercy. It tells you the knife is sharp. It does not yet tell you whether it will enter. It asks you to keep breathing while a man writes that he heard a child speak 2 prayers that disagree and yet mended the same heart. It asks you to accept that a time can become a place. 2:17 afternoon. He wrote it until the hour felt like a person sitting in the chair opposite. He wrote it until the page carried a bruise. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? Because Pine Hollow kept its own counsel and did not wish to bear the instruction of strangers. Because a man named Morrison arrived with a mule and twins, and a name that slips on every page it tried to sit upon before and after. Because the world in 1834 was neither ready to believe that breath could be shared without grievance, nor ready to confess that breath had always been shared without announcement. Because when a man put his hand upon a sentence that contained the word light and the word divide, and felt the heat under the skin of the paper, he understood that he could not put a period where a season had not finished. You can stand in the ruin today and see where the pulpit stones have slumped and where the ivy made a crown for a bell that has no rope. If you listen, you may hear one note without hand and without wind. You may hear nothing and tell yourself that silence is a cleaner honesty. You may taste iron in the air and decide it is only your own mouth telling you you are alive. It does not matter. The book lives even if no one looks at it again. The page ends where it ends. The hand that placed it under stones will not tell you why. We will go back to the first day, when the mule that kept no rhythm came down the lane, and the bell answered wrong. We will read how a man who had never tried to be more than kind learned to be careful with words, because words have edges. We will not be the first ones to find the small shiver that walks the spine of a leaf when a sentence breaks, and the break keeps the sentence from spilling too much into the world. There is still a smear on the margin where a thumb rested. There are still two little strokes at the end of a line that say two without saying the word. There is still the backward hand that says, something has turned and wishes to be seen from both sides. There is still the outlined time that never learned shame from attention. It is a book that did not ask to be a doorway. It is a doorway that did not ask to be opened by a crew that thought they were only saving timber. It is a piece of a life that did not expect to be asked for more than weather and corn and a prayer that sits clean beside a name and behaves. It is the first step and the last breath of a story that will not allow itself to be kept under a stone any longer. We have not yet counted the second day. We have not yet gone to the creek. We have not yet heard the women on the front bench say that the sound the girls made laid pressure on their ribs, and did not stop until long after they had gone home and set their pans on the stove and lifted their mouths to say the names of their own dead softly in their kitchens, and found that something had changed the air. We have not yet set our fingers on the page after the last page and felt only wood. But why did this happen? And why was it erased? Because that is what a place like this does when a thing like that passes. It lifts a stone. It keeps a book. It hopes the world will going on being ordinary while 1 hour learns to speak. 2:17 afternoon. The time is a person in the room. The room is a page. The page is a skin. The skin remembers heat. The heat remembers the creek. The creek remembers the day it moved up and not down. The bell remembers the note it dropped into a ridge no map will admit. The book came out of the ground because ground is not a vault. Ground is a mouth. It will not keep a word like that under its tongue forever. It will let it rise. It has. It is in your hands now. Maps pretended Pine Hollow was not there. Surveyors in Frankfurt drew their lattices of roads and ridges and left a vacancy where the creek should have been named. Tanner's 1829 map shows a fine stitching of counties, a bold line for the North Fork, then a pale dash where the track should turn, fading to nothing where Pine Hollow stands in the body and refuses the paper. The post rider's schedule, folded into the Kentucky Gazette once a month and pasted to a tavern door, lists North Fork area as roads permit, and then leaves 3 weeks blank each winter with a note the size of a fingernail impassable. In that absence, the place learned to conduct itself without being seen. The church house was a square of clapboard and plain glass set low among beech roots, the kind of building that looks smaller than the weight it carried. 1 door. 4 windows that fought the fog and often lost. A bell in the rafters hung from a beam darkened by hands that had pulled that rope for births, for cholera trenches, for brush arbor meetings, when a preacher's voice finally broke. The floor was pine that had learned Baptist rhythms. Stomps where the singing lined out, scuffs where they rose to pray. The benches were long and clean, with the polish of calico and broadcloth and overalls and hands that slid along them when the body could not sit entirely still. The minutes kept by Pine Hollow were a narrow ledger in a pinched hand, careful with ink and with God's patience. Meetings opened and closed, letters of dismission granted to families heading out toward Missouri, queries received from sister congregations asking how strictly this or that discipline should be applied when a boy stole bee gums, a line about Lyme in July of '33 when the cholera ran like a blue thread through the hollows and they dusted doorways and graves alike. It was a small congregation, 23 in a good month, as many as 30 when the mill opened at harvest, and men came down the ridge. But the ledger wrote those numbers without apology. They were what they were. They had stood up to sing and knelt to pray, and had made the covenant on a place the maps refused. Brush arbor seasons still hung in the speech of the older ones. Cane Ridge, 1801, had seared itself into Kentucky memory, and though Pine Hollow would not have claimed the fallen and the jerking favored by Methodists, they kept the quiet flame of that awakening and burned it slow. They lined out from books that traveled. Davison's Kentucky Harmony, 1850, patched with sweat and notes in the margin. Ripon's Select Hymns, 1787, bound into a size a pocket could carry. They sang the old long meters with the weight of time at the end of each line, so the breath had to build a bridge to the next. Weather was the first sermon every week. Frost dates, the thick or thin of sap, the way the creek talked when rain walked the rich. You can trace that in Pastor William Phillips' hand before Morrison ever arrived. He began with the sky because the sky spoke over everything and to everything. He was not a man to decorate his sentences. His book shows that. He learned his letters on a slate, and then on a deed, and then on the minutes of his church. If the barometer said fair, and the air said otherwise, he trusted the air and made a note to check the nail that held the peddler's instrument. The peddler had sold him the barometer a year before. A Boston glass, cracked along its face like a hair, but steady enough, hung over the door in a crooked wooden frame. It sat there like a foreign thought in a room that otherwise believed in seasons and providence. Pine Hollow was not immune to new notions. They simply took them in small cups. Someone's cousin in Lexington had brought back a tuning fork wrapped in paper, a curiosity the schoolteacher lent on high days. The physician 3 ridges west, Althea Boone, trained in the Thomsonian way, thick with the talk of cayenne and lobelia, kept a casebook in which she pasted small clippings from the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, and from the American Medical Repository. She wrote nervous sympathy in twins next to a line about egg and set the book aside because she trusted bark and sweat more than any printed theory. Kentucky in 1834 liked to pretend it had grown old enough to shrug off the worst. The truth was it had just lived long enough to learn that catastrophes can bring their own ordinary. Cholera had come down the Ohio like a blue, patient thing. The minutes do not write its name. They only write what it cost lime and boards, and a note about no singing at the graves for fear the breath would carry. The pulpits north and west argued whether God had sent it to score the land, or whether bad water had done what bad water does. Likely both, said men like William Phillips, because a body can die 2 ways at once and be buried only once. From Frankfurt and Lexington, and even as far as Philadelphia, papers blew in. Pamphlets on mesmerism, Franz Mesmer being a dead man whose ideas had learned to walk. Broadsides on phrenology with skulls divided into little named provinces like counties on a map. William Phillips would have seen a demonstration once. Some traveling lecturer letting a woman fall backward into a chair at the touch of a palm. But he would have looked away and looked down. He would have remembered that Francis Bacon wrote of hidden sympathies 200 years earlier, and that his own grandfather had learned to trust such talk only when it agreed with Scripture. The new sciences wore their coats like preachers and kept their collections ready, and the Ridge took them in with the same suspicion and amusement it afforded men who sold patent churns. Baptists in that country were older than the state. Elkhorn Association, founded 1785, North District, Green River. Loose eras of churches that sent messengers in haying season and exchanged letters between men who had learned to sign their names by candlelight. Associations warned against strange doctrine in flat lines and counted baptisms in a joy that sounded like the rustle of corn. If a congregation like Pine Hollow sent a letter in 1834, it would have been carried under a coat through a rain and read aloud in a meeting house bigger than their own, and the clerk would have written, "Received from a sister," asking for prayer and for counsel, and he would have meant it as he wrote it. Newspapers, when they found their way to that far hollow, arrived after the talk they carried had already done its work elsewhere. The Argus of Western America, the Kentucky Gazette, even a Louisville paper, when the stage was not bogged, printed chinwags that were a day late and a doctrine shy. The men read them under a beech and learned who had married who 2 counties over, and who had died, and how long the legislature had sat, without deciding things the Ridge did not need. They read that animal magnetism had charmed doctors and daunted them, that a professor in Philadelphia had written of sympathetic contagion between twins. The Phillips underlined that and wrote the date in a margin because he liked to know where words belonged. That a Boston man had sailed with a barometer and promised farmers that weather could be trapped in glass like a bee in a jar. It is not wrong to picture William Phillips sitting at his table with Fox's Book of Martyrs open under his elbow and Blackstone's commentaries propped against a plate. It is also not wrong to picture him ignoring both when a neighbor needed his fence mended or a widow needed her pig salted. He was a pastor the way a beam is a beam plane, set true and bearing. He had daughters of his own married off along the river and sons who had taken to the low land and learned to pay taxes and bring their own copies of the minutes home when they visited. He had never seen a girl who could divide a hymn in midair and put it back together. The creek that baptized Pine Hollow made a bend the exact shape of a cradle. Limestone let it do that, laying shelves under the eddies and polishing them in a way that made summer feet believe the water would be friendly and winter minds honor its chill. Stones kept a record longer than paper. 2 shallow hollows in a sill, where small heels had stood, 2 finger-wide cups in a bank where someone had gripped. Men remembered floods and a winter when it froze solid enough to take a wagon. Women remembered how it took a body gentle, and how it gives one back with a weight no man can hold alone. They did not write any of that in the minutes. They did not need to. Pine Hollow's schooling was a 1/4 mile up the slope in a 1-room house where a chalk line shared the board with an ink blot from spring. A teacher came and went, they always do. She lent a tuning fork once to the pastor and trusted its return. Because neighbors only half possess anything and count it a virtue to forget the other half. That same year a circuit rider passed and preached on the sympathy of the members in one body, and used a hand gesture that made the old ones think of a loom. He took supper with the Phillipses and slept under a quilt pieced of old dresses and new calico and left before light, because men like that believed arrivals and departures should be seen by as few as possible. If Pine Hollow had a doctor, she was Dr. Boone, with a saddlebag full of Thomsonian courage and a pocket of skepticism. She loved bark and steam and purges and knew when to avoid lancets unless a man was swollen with too much of his own confidence. Her casebook, kept for herself and for no other, held oddities because a brain refuses to let a rarity dissolve entirely. Single footprints along a double path in a snow that did not take prints lightly. Twins sharing a fever that never rose beyond the pulse. a child speaking in an older voice in a night the wind never touched. She scolded herself afterward and wrote, "Nerves," and shut the book. The ridge did not pay her for marvels. It paid her for children living and wives recovering and fathers standing up and going to work. On paper, the law was always older than the creek. Blackstone printed and reprinted a digest of Kentucky statutes bound in calf on a shelf in the clerk's house. Marriage, inheritance, case after case that pretended men behave. In practice, the ridge kept rules that had been born in kitchens and fields. Debt is a campfire you sit in front of until it is out. Funerals belong to the whole. A preacher's voice belongs to God and to women and to babies and the creek. Anything new must come carrying a jar of soaring and a story about someone we have met. The new sciencings were tolerated the way a fresh wind is tolerated in haying season. Good if it stayed out of your eyes. It is a mercy sometimes to live where time moves slower than the roads. Pine Hollow was a halt. Wagon days and ridge hours. The sound of a distant axe telling you how far a visitor has left to come and whether you should put the coffee back on the stove. When a visitor did arrive, the ridge looked him over from the porch and the field and the pen. If he was a preacher, they sat him near the lamp and put a plate in front of him and expected him to pay later in prayer. If he rode a mule and brought 2 children and wore a coat that had been turned once, they took him in with the same slow care they would give a stranger's story. You should see the word sympathy as it lived then. No tinsel, no parlor trick. People learned it from weather and from hogs and from children who slept back to back and rose together. Natural philosophers had used it 2 centuries earlier to name how strings set a desk humming when a violin is bowed and how tides follow the moon. Robert Boyle wrote its sober version. Mesmer spilled it into spectacle. In a ridge like Pine Hollow, the word was still meat, something in a woman's face that made the other women rise without her asking, something in a mule's ears that warned a man about the ridge before fog admitted its mistake, something in twins that nobody named aloud, but everyone saw in the way they reached for the same loaf without looking. And the twinning itself, ridges of story grew around it. Families knew a set of girls 2 creeks over who spoke to each other without moving their mouths. The schoolteacher told of a pamphlet from Philadelphia describing a pair who caught and shed measles within the same hour, though 100 miles lay between them. The Thomsonian doctor shrugged and said, "Nerves." The old man at the forge said God made strange economies in the womb and left it at that. Pastors preach 2 shall be one flesh at weddings, without thinking or perhaps thinking too much, how that text might read back into the twins who had sat on the front bench their whole lives. William Phillips had wed couples with that line and sent them down to the creek for the next week's baptism, and slept well afterward. He did not imagine he would be asked to hold it differently. The respectable surface held weather, plowing, chalk, a barometer with a crack, hymn books patched by palms, minutes that measured obedience in small squares of ink. The ridge had endured cattle plagues, and the filament of cholera, and rains that buried bridges, and men who claimed to bring a finer religion rolled into sheets and sold door to door. The house of prayer smelled as it always smelled. Rough pine, damp cloth warmed for worship. The creek went where it always went after rain, and then reminded the limestone it was older. The bell rang when called and sat quiet when not, except on days when the wind had been sharpened in the passes and learned to finger ropes. Into that plumbed and ordinary narrowness a mule stepped, and a man who would not be pinned, and 2 girls with dresses that fell the same and bodies that did not. Their father was the kind of preacher Kentucky invented, and then denied, uncredentialed, unclaimable, the kind of exhorter who could fill a brush arbor and empty a magistrate's patience with the same paragraph. His name appears in itinerant lists and disappears in the same line. The Elkhorn minutes for 1832 contain a rebuke to an irregular minister passing as a Baptist and troubling the weaker sort with wonders. The Madison Temperance Circular the same year praises E.M. for a heated speech that left a jug broken and a man contrite. He rode alone, mostly. He did not stay long anywhere. He knew where a ridge would take his voice, and where a ridge would fold it into a pocket and return it at dawn. All of this to say, nothing in Pine Hollow's way of life admitted the pieces that fell into place when the Morrison mule found the yard. If oddness happened in 1834, it did so in boots and on feet men knew. It did not arrange itself around an hour of the day and march into a ledger that had never suffered such company. The ordinary stood like a wall. 3 days tested it. The wall held, and also learned how to sound when knocked. And that is what mattered to William Phillips. When he sharpened his pen that first noon in September and wrote the hour, he would write again and again. 2:17 afternoon, without meaning anything other than this, that the ridge had refused clocks for years, and suddenly a clock had consented to be a ridge. He trusted minutes. He trusted the creek. He trusted the bell when the rope was in a boy's hand. He did not trust the bell when it answered from the rafters without permission. Yet he still wrote it down because the kind of pastor he was had been trained by seasons to tell the truth about the weather, even when the sky made him look a fool. Respectability is not a lie. It is the cloth the ridge used when it made itself a coat for storms. In 1834 it hung that coat by the door and brushed it clean and shook it, when it needed shaking and mended it where a nail had snatched a seam. If you look from the road, all you see is the coat on a peg. You do not see the day the barometer jumped in its frame, with a sound like a fork against a bowl, nor the afternoon the creek made a small hill under a voice and then lay flat as glass, nor the moment when two names set in ink, Clara Celesta, began to insist on their own math and taught a pastor's hand a new tremor. Before the event, there was the world in which it happened, a hollow the maps neglected, a congregation the minutes held steady, a pastor who knew where the ditch lay, and how to keep a mule from stepping in it, a region boiled in cholera and cooled by prayer, a year when mesmerists brought pins to the ridge and asked men to let their daughters sleep on chairs to prove a theory, a day when all of that respectable thickness was necessary and insufficient at once. The horror did not grow out of superstition. It came into a cleared field where everything had been named and asked that names be more careful. And so the book, and so the bell, and so the hour that refused to move. Day 1. The mule's hooves had learned no rhythm on the ridge. That is how Pastor Phillips begins the first entry. He notes noon by the sun on the sill, then sets down the arrival as cleanly as he can manage. Rev. Ezekiel Morrison arrived here, with 2 daughters upon his beast at the noon hour. The bell answered one for me, and added one for the ridge, without my hand upon the rope. 2:17 afternoon. He underlines the hour twice, then pricks a dot after it. A nail to keep the time from sliding. The girls, Clara, Celeste, step from the same dress in 2 bodies that do not agree how to wear it. One keeps her hair to the left, one to the right. He writes that without comment, the way a farmer writes which field took the plow hard that week. Women on the front bench remark later that the girls hold their hands folded in mirror manner, right over left, left over right. There is an echo where no echo belongs. At the opening prayer, the pastor's voice comes back a half, breath behind itself in a second pitch. He stops to listen for the boy in the loft, who should pull the bell rope. But the boy stands at the door, cap in hand. The congregation holds still in the pause that follows. Then the twins answer the prayer in unison and not in unison, the second voice landing with the slight lag of a second heartbeat answering a first. He writes it. Their speech together carries a distance between. He does not write wonder. He does not write dread. He sets the words down with care and turns to the business of a first day, the way a man walks where he must, and makes note of a soft place to test later with a stick. When a visitor arrives in Pine Hollow, it is the ledger's habit to carry the names of their dead, so the congregation may remember them aloud. There is a roll for that purpose. Names laid down in order so old grief can be counted without stirring the new. Brother Harlan, who always reads the roll, says a hand is lighter when the dead are remembered in a line. This time the twins speak the names with him. The syllables match. Then Brother Harlan falters. He has reached a name he cannot bring forward for private reasons. His mouth closes. The girls continue, but backward now. Phillips does not gild it. He writes plainly. The roll was spoken again, reversed, without error and without instruction given. He adds a small note in the margin, where he has never put a note before. They had not held the ledger. He marks the hour again. 2:17 afternoon. After the service, in the parsonage kitchen, a kettle circles counter to the stirrer's hand. The surface of the looking glass fogs and clears, as though breath had been laid upon it from both sides. A sentence appears backward, then forward, letter for letter, let them be one. He does not trust his own eyes. He writes the sentence twice, once in mirror script, once forward, by way of punishing his hand into obedience. Toward evening, the bell answers once from the rafters with no hand upon the rope. An old man laughs, calls wind, and the laugh sounds like a man throwing a stone into a pool he knows to be shallow. A woman covers her ribs with both palms and breathes slow, as if a weight has settled there and will not be shooed without civility. The barometer, with its crack like a hair, shows a twitch and then remembers itself. Pastor Phillips writes the weather anyway, because there is always weather if a man is patient enough to find it. He closes the entry with the mule, as if the animal might anchor what the day refused to. The mule walked a loose figure upon the yard, and refused a post as if the ground were marked, and he could see what the men could not. He does not strike the word marked. He lets it sit. Then, 2:17 afternoon, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. Day 2, he begins with weather by habit, and finds his hand has lied to him. He scratches out fair, writes changeable, scratches that out too. The page carries both words in shame, then offers the hour in margin as if to pay the debt. 2:17 afternoon. The second underline digs deeper. He brings the schoolteacher's tuning fork, wrapped in the Lexington paper it came in years ago. He fetches a bowl and fills it from the spring. He has planned this. He wants a measure that is not the ear or the heart. He sets bowl and fork on the table and asks each girl to speak. When Clara speaks, the fork hums a low, honest tone though no hand has struck it. The water leaps to make a small hill, no more than a coin's thickness above its place, then falls smooth. When Celeste speaks, the fork hums again, but a shade north of the first, close enough to grind against it, and make a third lonely voice in the room. The water hollows, a saucer pressed in the middle without finger. For a breath it stands in that strange valley, and then runs back into itself. When both speak, only, Our Father, and nothing ambitious. The fork stays still in the hand, as if remembering something that cannot be played, and the water refuses any shape at all. It is neither hill nor hollow. It holds itself calm as a held breath, then gives up and shivers a skin of beads along the edge. He writes it as figures because figures are kinder to men who cannot say what they have seen. He draws a hill and a bowl in quick strokes. He draws a line beside them with the word together and strikes it only once, because to strike it twice would break the day. He calls for Dr. Boone. She arrives at a pace that says she did not hurry, and that says also she came the moment the boy found her. She has a saddlebag and a set of patient eyes, and hands that know where a pulse lives and where a man's imagination does. She takes each girl's wrist. He writes her words faithfully, because a doctor's words are easier to quote than a child's. The pulses begin together and occupy the same beat, and then they slip, one a hair behind the other, and then they join and go as they should, and then they wander. I would call it a sympathetic fever, William, but there is no heat. She asks Ezekiel Morrison about the birth. He puts his hat back on his head, an answer of its own. Dr. Boone looks at the barometer and at the girls, then puts her hand to the barometer's glass and to the girls' foreheads, then returns her hand to the glass. She shrugs. It is her way of admitting interest without permitting awe. There is a song at evening. They choose an old long meter a man can test his breath against, and have done so for 50 years. Kentucky, harmony lies open and the lining out begins. A place comes where the congregation splits by habit. Half the ridge lifting, half descending, like two paths the same road could take. The twins close their eyes, and the voices mend without anyone feeling the stitch. Pastor Philip stops singing. He listens very hard, and thinks about how a loom works and about the text two shall be one flesh, and about a verse in Ecclesiastes where a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, and about how cords can snare, too. Animals gather at the edges of attention, because that is their way when air changes. 2 crows take the roof and watch, black tools folded. 2 does stand inside the fence, where the gate has a habit of letting them in when no man looks. The mule finds his figure again, and writes it upon the yard, ending where he began with the careful sorrow of a beast that has made a point no man can read to any use. A dog refuses a shadowed spot and chooses sun, and looks ashamed of the choosing, which is a dog's curse. Pastor Phillips makes the girls sit together in 2 chairs, and then asks them to answer when he uses each other's name. They do it without a smile. Then he asks them to walk a line, and say the name not their own, and they do that too. And he writes their feet right quick and their eyes calm, and the congregation hungry for a word that keeps this in the world where it belongs and not the other one. He puts this down. Clara answered for Celeste. Celeste for Clara, offered no wrong this day, and I do not know whether to praise them for obedience or fear them for the ease. He closes the book for a moment there. The ink has deepened in the bottle while he thought. He lifts the pen and the bottle kisses the nib and leaves a dark bead on the page, where he writes the hour again without looking. 2:17 afternoon. Then he writes something in both directions on purpose, as if to show the page what the girls have taught it. Let them be one, written forward. OQL, written backward under it. He waits to see whether the ink will bleed. It does not. He rests his palm where the words sit, and the skin leaves a little gloss on the leaf, and the gloss dries, and the gloss remains. Supper is bread and beans, and a spoon that will not sit where the hand puts it. The kettle insists on circling counter to the motion that stirs it. You cannot feed a whole story to a congregation. You feed them the bread, and the rest goes into the parsonage sink with the rinse water, and the hand remembers where the bowl made its hill. Dr. Boone leaves, not late, because she believes that men misremember when they are sleepy. On the step she says to William, "There are things that live in bodies that will never live on paper." Then she says, "Try to write it anyway. It may be we will both be helped." He nods and watches the ridge take her, and lifts his eyes to where the star should be and finds cloud. He writes the hour. He underlines it until the paper has had enough. 2:17 afternoon. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Day 3, rain in the night, walks the ridge with soft feet and fills the creek, until it speaks up where it goes usually quiet. The sill stones are damp, and the cradle, bend, is dark as if somebody had turned that part of the day backward. The barometer's crack grows a second hair by morning, a spider's path from the top left to the bottom. The pastor touches the glass with 2 fingers, because men touch what they cannot change. Ezekiel Morrison asks for baptism for both daughters. This is not strange. Any father would do the same. Get them under now. Cover them with what can be given while they are small and the world is big. The creek is where it is always. The stones know where they have always been. The book has the words printed in the same order 100 times before. There is nothing in the sentence buried with him that should object to being read the same in every hollow. They go down together. The father, the pastor, the twins, the few who will stand in cold water for someone else. The women hold shawls tight with hands that have pulled babes out of tubs and pigs from fence wire. Brother Harlan takes off his shoes and will not roll his trousers because he knows the place the edge will find and shame him if he gives it a name. A child counts steps under breath because that is the only way to keep from asking a question aloud. William makes his notes later, of course. In the moment he is a man holding the arm of a child and the arm of God and trying to split his hands only once. He writes what he can. I lowered the first, and the second gasped before the water touched her. The hair upon the first lifted as though a hand had blessed her, and then lay down as though a hand had soothed her, and the second wiped her eyes, though they were not wet. He strikes through wiped and writes covered. He cannot tell whether the words have lied to him, or he has lied to the words. He tries again. The water came up, not down. He scratches came and writes rose, and then scratches rose and writes rose again, because that is what his hand believes, even if his mind does not. He lifts the first and the second makes the face of someone who has seen light, and cannot say whether it is friend or foe, because it is only so much of something, and not yet a shape. Then there is the place no man can hold steady, at the words buried, and raise the twins change places without walking. 2 witnesses will swear to that, and the rest will swear the girls changed their faces and stayed where their feet were. The pastor cannot put a verb to it. He writes they divided the light between them, and I could not tell which child stood in which place any longer. He begins to complete the sentence, and the page breaks under his hand. The leaf tears from the gutter with a soft groan like a board that has learned to bear too much. That is where the record ends. What the men say after is the thing you would expect. One of them says which, and the word sounds worse in pine and water than it does in a story. A wife puts her hand on his sleeve and takes the word from his mouth with the small pressure that has made him appear wiser than he is for 40 years. A woman under a shawl says one reflection for 2 girls and will not take her shawl down until the pastor has gone home and has written in his book and been sent to bed by a wife who has seen 200 baptisms and knows there is nothing a blanket will not solve that a prayer will not at least dignify. The bell answers from the rafters at the exact middle of the day. Phillips cannot resist writing it, because a bell is a fact. He writes also the hour, because his hand has learned to do it the way a throat has learned to swallow when a ladle comes. 2:17 afternoon. The peddler's barometer scratches, itself another hair along the crack, as if glass could be taught to tremble when certain sounds are in the air. He leads them out and up the path and into the house and puts a hymn in their mouths that has always made the ridge honest. He does not write which hymn, because there are some names you keep for the next world. He does write, I cannot say how God's arithmetic would have us add what we saw to what we have been given to speak in the water. He writes it as arithmetic, because the ridge honors numbers, when words have been used up in men's mouths and need a day to cool. There is that matter of the mule. On the day that should have moved on, he writes the beast walking his figure 8 again, and finishing where he began, and that he patted the mule's neck like a man does when he has borrowed an animal's patience or wisdom, and knows he has not paid in full. There is that matter, too, of Dr. Boone who stands in the door, with a towel and a look a neighbor uses, when someone has brought their house to her on a plate. She has thought, and has decided to hold no opinion until more evidence arrives, and still she says to the pastor, in a voice meant only for one man, "If you lay one hand on each child and ask for a pulse, it will make a math you can survive." He does it and writes what she tells him to write. 2 pulses together, then one goes a hair behind, then together again. He does not know how that helps, only that it gives him a way to turn his head when the room bends. Clara answers to Celeste. Celeste answers to Clara. Ezekiel says that is no witch, only obedience to a father whose voice is one voice. There is a layer of wariness under his words that no man born to comfort would notice. William hears it and cannot shelve it anywhere in his book. He writes a smaller note. Speaks as if he has lost a part and found it twice. They eat what can be eaten. They keep what can be kept. The women clean shawls and hang them where the stove will see them, and not the girls. The men stand outside and discuss the state of the creek, as though to do so were not a brave and decent reaction to what another man has seen in the same water 10 breaths before. The entry, the last we have, closes with the shortest weather line in all his years. Rained upon us and then ceased. After it, the torn place. In the weeks to come, the story will grow fences and weeds and small gates men open and close according to what they need to live. Someone will say they were not the same girls day by day. Someone will say an exchange was made by night to test charity. Someone will say Ezekiel had studied with mesmerists and cued his daughters to tricks that play well on ceilings with knots in them. Someone will say God answered a father's pride by untying a rope he had no right to pull. Someone will say a deacon spoke witch out loud and lost part of his hearing for a season, and his wife swore it served him. The minutes will not carry any of that. They will carry meal bought and a note about the barometer's glass, which had to be seated after the crack wandered where it pleased. What remains for the page is this. The bell answered once without a hand. The barometer drew a new hair. The mule made his thought in the dust. 2 girls divided light. A man of a good hand could not end his sentence. They set to work upon the journal the way men set to work upon a drifted fence. Lifting, tapping, testing, stepping back. Every lift made a different shape of truth. Every tap found a hollowness where someone else had sworn solidity. Theories grew the way weeds do in a fresh cut, roots shallow, seeds quick, blossoms impossible not to notice. Each came with its own proof, the way lies do and prayers do and memories do. The page did not yield to any of them. It lay there, breathing its own slow air. One set of men, being fond of sense, called it natural sympathy, and let that be the line they leaned on. Twins are a kind of house with a shared chimney, they said. Smoke finds either flue and comes out where it can. Private speech, shared breath when frightened, a habit of finishing each other's corn, husking songs till the room forgets there are 2 throats. The bell, a draft. The barometer, a cheap Boston glass with a crap that crept when the door slammed, and when weather changed inside a room not built for glass. The fork, a toy warmed in a teacher's pocket, so that the metal sighed when a voice shook the table. The water's hill and valley. Caustics, any man who had watched sun on a mill pond would tell you as much. Light lays tricks upon water, bowls will lift and hollow if you stare with fear in your throat. The hour 2:17. A nervous mark. The pastor, bless him for his care, made a small altar to 1 minute the way men make small altars to jobs they believe they cannot afford to botch. In the papers, when the story made it to town, the word used was irregularity. A polite way to say, such things happen in hollows, such things do not travel well. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Another school carried its devices in velvet. Mesmerism had wandered west in pamphlets, and in men who wore coats like physicians and smiles like thieves. They said Morrison had sat under such a one and learned a trick worth more than sermons on a dry day. Animal magnetism, the old word had it. Wonders done by setting one body, the master of another's breath, moving faces like a hand moves puppets, making spoons circle against their stirrers, teaching bowls to stand still when music rules them. A fork can be primed by heat or stroke. It will answer a voice if the voice has been taught its pitch. A father can cue a child with a breath and a hand upon a shoulder at a single hour when the sun slices the ridge, just so. 2:17 by the pastor's eye, which has learned the length of a winter shadow better than any philosophical instrument could. The bell. Ropes can be knotted to answer when tied to beams, and to draft at a set minute in a valley that breathes like a pair of lungs between oaks. The creek. A face can be taught stillness till it shows only one underwater, and the rest is the pastor's care not to shame himself with a sentence he will have to live in. Coin offered at a brush arbor tastes the same, whether paid for zeal or spectacle. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. An older woman from farther back in the ridge put it plain and left it there. Those were not the same girls all 3 days. Her proof was a scar that sat upon one knee on the first noon, and upon the other knee on the second, and a birthmark that showed in the parsonage glass, left, handed on Tuesday, and right, handed on Wednesday. If you believe mirrors speak the truth. Mountain families will test charity by sending a different child to the same door, she said, and watch to see if bread tastes the same in the mouth of the second. Someone laughed and counted the mending in her apron, and said the ridge loves a parable. She did not blink. She said the shawl had covered one reflection, not because God played tricks, but because men do. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The men of the book preferred to lay light across the page and let ink confess. A county clerk, one of those fellows who can smell a forged hand in the next county, swore the page with the mirror script did not match the hand upon the earlier weather. He spoke of hands that tire and hands that flourish, and the way an old pen makes a different thinness of line than a new pen will. He said that 2:17 in the margin had been retraced after the fact, as if a man came back later looking for a way to tie a day to a time he remembered too vividly and not vividly enough, and the dot was put down with a nib that did not live in 1834. He nodded toward the neat thumbprint in modern ash the archivists found pressed into a corner during a 1901 handling. Mischief in the stacks will ruin anyone's faith, he said. The archivists in 1987 laid their clean cotton hands upon the book and wrote foxing uniform, chain lines true to 1830s rag paper, iron gall ink feathering where it should feather. Both true, said the book. Both unhelpful. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A theologian with a sore patience quoted the associational minutes of 1835, a congregation in our bounds afflicted by strange doctrine. He would not say which. He suggested gently that Brother Phillips, a good man, no one denies it, had been tempted to make a text live upon flesh as a lesson to the hard-headed. Two shall be one flesh, he had preached at weddings for years. Two shall be one, he had said over the bowl at Pabst's singing. Perhaps God answered a presumption by answering it far enough to bring fear without bringing harm. Divide the light is not a scripture phrasing, it is a poet's. The Lord teaches pastors to keep their poets tidy. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Others took the divine more roughly, the way rough men will. A deacon had used the word witch by the creek and found his right ear dim for a season afterward. Easy it not warning enough, the bold said. There is a verse about men who trouble households with new talk. There is a verse about brother against brother. There is a verse about the man in the tombs crying, with voices not his own. Twins have been blamed since villages learned to count to 2. The ridge swings between charity and fear, like a gate on a lazy hinge. Call it devil and sleep, call it God and quake. Neither tells you what to feed the girls for breakfast. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Dr. Boone, when asked too often for a sentence she knew would be carried wrong, let her casebook stand guard. She had written, sympathetic fever with no heat, and a man of letters from Lexington turned that into hysterical contagion. He had theories about uterine winds and sisters who hyperventilate when men condescend. He had never pulled a baby from a blue mother with his own 2 hands. He had never seen a mule write an 8 in a yard and refuse a post. Boone raised a brow and said breath is a fact. She would take it in pairs, if that is how God gave it to her. She showed the pulses to a magistrate's wife. The wife felt the together and the apart, and put her hand over her heart, as if it were misbehaving, and then said, I am sorry. I should not have taken the gentleman's time. Boone shut the book and sat with her a while without speaking. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A traveling lecturer, the kind that tied a map of the phrenological skull to a tree, tacked on a demonstration to the story, and sold tickets for it. He claimed to have known Morrison in a different county. Watch for the father's hands. He told a Louisville audience, and you will see signal, where you thought to see miracle. He listed the hour like a stage, man's cue. Sun through the west window at that season, striking the fork on the table, where a boy had rested the instrument upon a knot, the bell answering because a boy had tied the rope under the eaves to a loose shutter, the barometer speaking because a hand put there had left oils that made a crack wander. He smiled. He cashed his coin. He left before questions bit. Pine Hollow heard and went on feeding their children. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There was also the theory that most embarrasses people who love tidy endings, misremembering writ large. Illness comes to a hill after cholera, like fog comes after rain. The body is quicked by small shocks and answers to nothing but its own habit of tremble. A pastor can meet a season where his hand learns to write a minute as a charm against the hour. He can return to the page later and put in mirror script because he cannot bear to see the words as they stood when the room bent. A second hand can add that script to hold his memory in place when it slips. A page can become a palimpsest without anyone believing he is telling a lie. The book has pressed hair along a sentence, after all. Someone leaned too close once and shed part of herself between words. The archivists lifted it and left it there, a small confession that the living cannot resist, living upon the dead's talk. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Family trees, those honest liars, took the story as a chance to tidy what should not be tidied. One Morrison cousin said there were no twin daughters, only a son on the Tennessee side who learned to preach with a voice that could carry in cane. Another produced a sampler with the names CIRA and CST Cross, stitched on either side of a single stalk of wheat, and said it had hung in a kitchen no one could now find. The wheat made men superstitious. A third family, Philip's kin, said their ancestor had torn the page himself because his wife bid him. She had seen a thing in the water that would not bear a sentence and would break the kitchen if the words came into it. The sampler went moldy and the wheat bent. The page went away. Marriages were made anyway. but not everyone agreed on what really happened. The creek kept its own counsel and answered men with light. "One reflection for 2 girls," said the woman under her shawl. "Any pool in a cradle, bend at mid-day will give you a single face, if the light makes its mind to drive both eyes into one path," said a miller who understood lenses, because his living depended on a clear line. He had seen one boy look like 2 under purling water, and he had seen one woman disappear under a slick, and then appear again with a shout she could not have uttered if she had truly been gone. He shrugged. Water wants to help men lie to themselves. It is one of its kindnesses. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A 2:17 afternoon. That is the hook the mind cannot shake. Why should a hollow that refused clocks consent suddenly to be called by a minute? One practical man said the ridge wind turns about that hour every day. If the sun has its way, valley breeze to slope breeze and back, it will lift a bell. If a rope's loop lies where it ought to, it will nudge a cracked glass that has hung too long upon a nail set half a finger off. Another said the pastor had learned to write the minute when he felt his heart jump. A man grieving can make a time a person and greet him each day without confessing the cause to those who listen. A third said the hour was a device. Men will bind their fear to one peg to spare the whole wall. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There were darker ridges of talk, and they do no one any good except to prove we have always carried knives in our speech. Someone said the girls were not true twins, but the remains of a failed cutting, that is ignorance. No one in 1834 had cut what some men cut later, and called it mercy. Someone said one child was a second child born from a who'd already died, and that the father carried guilt and wrapped it in wonder. That is uglier, and still says more of the man who said it than of the man accused. Pine Hollow does not lack for men who will test bravery with cruelty when the day gives them permission. The day did not. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The association's clerk, dry as an August husk, wrote to a brother in another county. Phillips has been found irregular in certain proceedings. He did not name them. He attached a list of expenses: meal for visitors, feed for a beast, thread and pins for mending, yet unknown. A man reading that in Lexington believed he understood. Irregularities become rumor's coin. But the same clerk sent also a note. He has kept minutes faithful. Faithful to what is the kind of question that keeps a man awake. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. In 1987, when the book came up, the archivists put it in their cold drawer and wrote their careful lines. Japanese tissue mended the torn leaf with a kindness you can see only under raking light. The pressed hair across the sentence lies where the sentence lies. They divided the light between them. A volunteer, no one can remember his name now, said, "Hair always looks darker when it is not growing." He meant nothing by it, and still the sentence changed shape in the room when he said it. Later, another volunteer, being asked to read the entries aloud for a film, refused to do the mirror script in unison with the foreword. "Twice is a kind of mockery," she said. The film was bad and the ground refused to be told by a microphone. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A last theory comes on soft feet because it wants no victory. It says men build structures for their fear and their pride both, and the structures do not always hold when time sets its weight upon them. A pastor loved numbers because numbers had never lied to him about rain or debt. A father loved breath because breath had returned to him when he had once thought it gone. A doctor loved pulses because pulses had allowed her to answer men without asking their permission first. 2 girls came into a small church with their father. The ridge put its hands upon its ribs. The clock sat down and would not leave for an hour that returned 3 times. Nobody asked for that. Nobody slept well after. The rest is the arithmetic people do to pay for nights when they are not allowed to close their eyes. Pine Hollow is a mouth and a pantry and a graveyard and a bowl. It swallowed what it could and hid what it could not digest under a stone. You can lay your ear to the stone and hear only your own blood. You can lift the stone and find a book and a hair and a sentence and 3 days. You can set 10 men in a row, and each will speak a different truth, and each truth will throw a shadow in a different shape upon the same page. The bell will answer once at mid-day when no one has asked it. Someone will say wind. Someone will say God. Someone will say the rope was tied. The truth will keep both feet in 2 places and call itself obedient. The church fell to frame and nail and then to weather. But the ground did not forget the shape it had been asked to hold. The sill stone at the path to the creek kept 2 shallow hollows, as if small heels had stood there again and again, until even limestone learned the weight of waiting. In summer, children of men who do not call themselves superstitious fit their feet there for a dare. In winter, ice forms thin perfect circles in each cup, freezes clear, and never thickens beyond a coin, no matter how hard the ridge breathes steam into the cold. The rest of the creek gives up hard white. The hollows hold glass. If you lean over them at midday, your face divides neatly down the nose, and you can tell yourself it is simply the light. The bell is gone, sold for scrap in a year when hay was mean and the county needed a fire wagon. But a note remains in the rafters that no longer exist. People who do not own watches say they hear it once, in the middle of the day, where the church used to draw a roofline. People who do own watches find that when the sound touches the skin behind the ear, their wrists disagree. One wrist says 2:17. One wrist says it is a little after. Digital faces stay polite and say nothing. Later they have gained a minute that cannot be persuaded to move. Someone will observe that ridges throw sound unexpectedly. He will be right. Someone will reply that sound cannot convince a clock to add a minute the way a story can convince a room to hold its breath. She will also be right. Grass keeps its rule around the weld. A ring bare as a plate even in wet years when dahlias outnumber common sense. A mower forced to cut close to it will swear his belt jumps a tooth at that circle and steadies again after. The man who owns the mower will say the ground is uneven. Then he will remember the mule, and the figure 8 the beast insisted upon the yard, and he will keep that recollection for himself. When the light is right, there are 2 rings in the throat of the well, one bright, one dull. People quarrel about which is which. They always have. There is a taste doing a slow work in the air, iron, maybe, or old lion pine, and it does not lift though the trees keep their side of the bargain and exchange leaves when asked. The journal has a new house now, a cold drawer with a name more expensive than the men who cut the pulpit stones would have believed in. Japanese tissue, thin as breath, mends the torn leaf, and does not lie about itself. Under raking light, you can see where a hand once strained against paper, and the paper let go, so that a sentence would not be forced to live in a world where it seemed no longer decent. The archivists handle the book gloved. They will not read the entries aloud in pairs any longer. Once, in 1988, 2 good-hearted interns tried it for a small film and spoke the mirror script in unison with the forward line for the camera. When they turned the next page, both leaves lifted together and would not be persuaded to fall until the room had emptied of everyone who was not the book. The film cut around that. The archive remembered anyway. A pressed hair crosses the page where the sentence breaks. They divided the light between them, and I could not tell which child stood in which place any longer. The hair lies darker than it should because hair always looks darkest when it has been fixed to a place where it cannot grow, and pretend dying is a choice. It bisects the words. no one will remove it. A staffer once suggested they should. Another staffer touched the glass and thought better of it. Raking light shows also the gloss of a palm. A man pressed his skin to that leaf, and then lifted his hand and slept a little worse, every night thereafter, until he learned not to ask the book to finish its own sentence for him. The margin keeps its birthdays. 2:17 afternoon. The pastor's double underline sits there like a small gate, and if you put a glass upon it the ink brightens, as if freshly laid, and then fades to the brown all decent iron gall will take with years. You can tell a page has carried a dot too long by the way the paper grows a tiny hill under the pin. There is a hill there. A clerk in 1901 left a thumbprint in ash near the dot. A neat whorl the exact size of a man doing his best work and doing it in a room where dust descends the moment a truth is spoken aloud. Archivists say the phrase backward, one at a time but never together OQL. They will read it into a recorder separately and allow the machine to stitch both tracks if an editor insists. There is a superstition about pears now, in a building where superstition is not supposed to sit even in the break room. One intern wears 2 watches, digital and analog. She says it is so that when one refuses to move she can scold the other into telling her what day it is. She is joking. She does not always look as if she is. People bring twins to Pine Hollow the way people bring unhappy coins to fountains. Fraternal. Identical. Girls with braids and boys with the exact same cowlick, and a mother who is trying to keep the fact of them from spilling the coffee she has been holding steady since they were born. A pair from Lexington came, held hands in the old doorway, walked to the sill where heels had taught limestone courtesy, and went home with headaches that took turns for a week. Right temple, left, right, left, and then mended in the new habit of allowing strangers their sentences. They reported finishing other people's prayers without meaning to for 3 consecutive Sundays, and then not being able to do it again when they tried. They did not sleep well those weeks for fear of listening in on what did not belong to them. They learned not to tell anyone who would write it down and bring a theory to their table. 2 brothers stopped on a drive toward Hazard and stood in the yard because a grandmother had laid a line upon them as boys. Take care at Pine Hollow. Take care of each other everywhere. They went to the truck to leave and saw only one face in the side mirror with both of their collars. There is a trick that light does when a hill leans and glass has lost respect for edges. They argued with the glass. The glass held the line as long as it could, and then returned to doing its proper work. They said nothing for 5 miles. Later, one told a wife and the other told a dog, and a dog is better at receiving such news. A school bus came one October with children who had been given the kind of worksheets that make enemies of ruins. They were told not to touch the stones, and touch them more carefully than when they are told they may climb anything they please. The guide spoke about 1834 without describing cholera in a way that would wake sleeping nightmares, and the old tuning fork was mentioned in the way such relics are always mentioned, with a mixture of apology and longing. 2 small girls asked whether the hair in the journal belonged to one or to both. The guide said it belonged to whoever had leaned too close once, been reminded kindly that pages are not lungs. On the ride home, both girls fell asleep and woke at the exact middle of town with the exact same sentence on their tongues. We have to be kind or we won't mend. The driver did not hear. A bus has enough other sorrows. Not everything belongs to Pine Hollow. The Reverend Morrison left no burial where men count stones and pay masons to pin a name down. There is a Morrison, no initials, signing for a small parcel near the Tennessee line in 1839. A clerk's hand has written his surname as if it wishes to be rid of the page. There is a short notice in a Tennessee Baptist circular warning against a certain exhorter who troubles sound doctrine with wonders. The mark is anonymous in the way such warnings are when the flesh is still raw. A dry goods ledger in 1841 bills a man for 2 dresses made in different sizes, paid with a coin that had a cross filed into one edge for recognition. 2 dresses in different sizes can belong to sisters. They can belong to one child twice. They can belong to a father who wanted to leave evidence of carefulness, where a town would not care about blood. The coin with its filed cross lives, nowhere now that will admit it, and still a legend says you can tell a Morrison quarter by the bite the file took from it. A notch small as the hour the ridge learned to pronounce. There is a story, soft-footed, like all stories that wish to live in houses that banish rumor at the door, that only one child walked out the creek path, though 2 feet left wet shapes. The story improves itself in the mouths of people who love such workmanship. It learns doors and shawls and words, whispered into the combing of hair the next morning, and never spoken again. There is another, pitched in the other key, that says Pastor Phillips tore his own page, because God asked him to spare the congregation a sentence that would bruise all future sentences to the same black. He did not want his book to be a door a man could open and fall into forever. The men who love rules believe that is not a pastor's right. The women who love mercy more than they love rules think sometimes our better men are forced to decide who is strong enough to carry which kinds of news. Almost every year someone asks a different archive to open a different loft. A meeting house in another hollow. A parsonage that now is a store that sells other kinds of spirits. Perhaps the missing leaf. They write, as if a page could wake one morning and walk across the ridge to a less sorrowing drawer. Paper wanders. So do men. So do children. Pastor Phillips did not keep a blame for that. His ledger shows it. He dismissed men with letters to churches downriver, and sent daughters with quilts and a word of blessing, and made notes about the weather the morning they left. If he tore his own page, he would have written down the hour anyway. His hand could not help falling into obedience where it found the only law that had served him without insult. The association minutes remain stubborn as August corn, a congregation within our bounds afflicted by strange doctrine. Brother W. Phillips considered irregular in certain proceedings. Expenses meal for visitors, feed for a beast, thread and pins, glass mender for instrument over door, actions admonition privity, prayer requested L public, action deferred. Those 3 words, action deferred, have their own chill, the way a creek has a temperature that breathes intelligence into ankles. The book in 1987 taught the archivists a similar politeness. There came a day when a curator would not allow the mirror script and the foreword to be read in the same air. Twice is a kind of mockery, she said, and did not mean God, and did not mean the girls, and did not mean the room. She meant her own heart would not be able to bear itself if it learned how to echo perfectly, and thereby learned how to stand next to itself forever. A man tried to capture the bell on a tape recorder once. He set the device where the rope used to land, pressed the button at noon, laid down, and put his hands behind his head the way farmers pretend they have chosen the sky instead of having been chosen by it. At midday he sat up. The air thinned, then thickened. He heard the note. The device did not. Machines will betray a man more quickly than breath will. That has always been true. Not every echo is an insult. 2 old women, the kind who refuse to be called twins and ask, instead, that people count where they have stored flour and where they have borrowed confidence, came one summer and sat in the shade where the church door used to throw a rectangle on the yard. They refused the sill and refused the well, but stayed long enough to see the present learn to confuse itself. When the bell's absence arrived with its event, One woman reached for the other's hand and squeezed, as if telling a pulse to wait for her. The other woman squeezed back and said aloud the word together. It carried more weight than the hour could. The creek has offered up nothing else the pastor would have let live on the page. A smooth stone in the shape of a kidney, a bluish bottle neck that would have caught light just right in the hedge if men in that hollow had ever favored such spells over soap and scolding. 2 coins rotted so thin with water's niceness that, when a boy tried to rub them clean, they crumbled into green dust. The ledger in the archive carries those fines on a separate slip written by a volunteer who was too tender for the work. These are not evidence. His supervisor wrote in red below, and then added more gently, we do not know what they are. It is natural for a county to turn a place like this into a kind of test. How a man speaks about it will tell you where he has taught his fear to sit. He may bring the word witch to his mouth again, because he has been told that makes him one of the brave. He may carry only weather. He will pretend the bell and the barometer are just weather. He may bring grief, and grief has no quarrel here. The ridge remembers cholera, and fences torn down for firewood, and bells answered for boys who fought in armies whose names were far too fine for what they asked men to do. He may bring only curiosity, and that is a kind of courtesy, when it does not wear its boots into the kitchen. Twins return and leave, and sometimes they leave a kindness behind that does not know how to leave the yard. A habit of letting strangers finish their prayers. A pause where talking used to override listening. A leaf pressed into a pocket, and then forgotten until laundry asks whether anything in this house needs mercy. Not every pair binds to the hour. The hour has work to do somewhere else too. But the pattern persists enough to teach men with clipboards not to tally it. It is not a count that wants a number. No burial for Ezekiel Morrison means the ground anywhere may take responsibility for him. People put him where they need him, riding on through, riding back. Laying his hand on a girl's brow when a fever that never rises still frightens her father into standing on the porch all night keeping watch on air. He was not the kind that doors will keep out forever. Exhorters do that. Doors are for merchants and magistrates and men who like to be asked to sit down. There is a legend that in a flood year he stood on a sill and read the text about 2 shall be 1 flesh and made a sound like a man trying not to break. There are a dozen legends. They do not shape the yard as much as 2 shallow cups do. That is why the yard is the only honest teller. Perhaps the missing leaf lies under a different floor, held in place by a stone that has not yet been asked to give. Perhaps it never existed, and the book you have holds every sentence a man could afford to write for the sake of his congregation's sleep. Perhaps the missing is the point. A blank forces a congregation to become an organ that remembers breath without needing all the words. If there were one more page, and if it said plainly what it feels like to watch 2 girls divide the light and then mend it, some of us would be spared imagination, and some of us would be spared doubt, and neither of those gifts would keep us from needing kindness anymore. This is where such stories always step aside and make room for belief or for scoffing or for the more useful middle category called humility. Pastor Phillips would writhe to hear his name under the word haunted. He would like the word faithful better. He would approve of threads and pins expensed and lemon oil set aside for the benches and the barometer reset with a nail that doesn't wander. He would be uneasy knowing his journal has become a stand-in for a boy under the rope, something the bell can use to speak to a ridge after the rope is gone. Perhaps you will find the missing leaf if you dare ask the archive that keeps the key. Perhaps you will be told, we have mended what we can, and learn to see completion where paper refuses it. Perhaps you will stand where the door once was and hear nothing and feel quietly relieved, and then fail to understand why you feel a smaller kind of ache in your ribs later when your own kitchen goes still at noon. Perhaps you will bring your own twins and teach them how to wait for another person's words, as if a bowl of water could become a hill simply because someone asked carefully. If you want me to continue uncovering these buried histories, subscribe now and share your theory in the comments. Were Clara and Celeste one child twice, or two children once, or something our old books do not yet name? Was the bell wind, or contrivance, or mercy answering itself? Did Pastor Phillips protect his people by breaking his own sentence, or did someone else ask the paper to stop out of a love that did not want truth to spoil sleep? The ridge will not answer. The hour might. 2:17 afternoon. The rest is what we do with breath when it arrives in pairs.